Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to our next session in the Civic Engagement series, where we are going to be talking about what is on my ballot. As you guys know, we have elections coming up very soon, and Professor Melissa Kenfield is going to give us some information about what is going on. Just as a few housekeeping things before we get started, if you have a question, you can put that in the chat and we'll get that answered at the end. And if you are here for credit in one of your classes, we will also have an attendance link put into the chat at the end. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Professor Kenfield.
Well, hello. I am super excited to be talking about local elections. I have been a local election nerd for a while, and often my friends make fun of me for it because I think that city councils and school boards are where the exciting things really do happen when it comes to local politics. So I'm just so excited to be sharing about this today. And as has been mentioned, we'll be going through this presentation. We do have some links on here, and so I would love to get some feedback in the chat along the way if these links are live for y'all. And so we're going to be talking about things that are on your ballot, and it's very helpful if you check what's going on the ballot that you'll actually be having. So we've got links here for Vote 411, which is from the League of Women Voters, and they have a voter lookup where you can find out what's going to be on your ballot, as well as if you're in Tarrant County, there's a website called Tarrant County Votes. So one of the things to make this presentation customized for you is if y'all can check what's going on your ballots particularly, and I can be sure to cover what I know about those. And then I also included a link to an article in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram about some of the local elections, because my disclaimer is I have been a local election nerd for a while, but in a different county. And so I'm still learning about all the things going on with y'all, which I think is going to actually be a strength to show the commonalities that we experience. So if y'all can check your sample ballots and share in the chat what's going on, that would be super helpful for me. So moving on, one of the questions that I hear occasionally is, didn't we just have an election? And this is a common refrain because in the spring we do have quite a few different elections. So back in March we had the primary elections, which is essentially when we pick who's going to be the best representative for the major parties. So in March, we had primaries where you had to identify either as Republican or Democrat and pick who should be on the ballot in November. Now, fun fact, some of those races weren't decided yet, that some of them are going to a runoff. So you might also be seeing information about another election going on towards the end of May. But the one that we have coming up right now, what you should be seeing signs for is our city and school board elections, and those typically happen in May. And I've got this note on here, technically they are nonpartisan elections. So when you go to vote, they're not going to ask you which ballot do you want. Everybody should be running as nonpartisan. Now we'll circle back to that in a few minutes. And then another interesting thing going on is that every year our state legislature will be going through proposed changes to our Constitution, to the Texas Constitution. And I know our government instructors would love to talk a lot more about why it is that Texas amends our Constitution so much. And usually, most of the time, those will happen in a November election, but we actually have a couple that showed up on the May election. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. A few of the things that I covered last time I presented on this is that there's just a lot going on, and I want to give everybody space to figure things out. There's this term, it's called ballot fatigue, and it's what happens when there's just so many different things going on your ballot that it can be overwhelming at times to sort out what does each position do, how do I know who to vote for, how do I know what a good candidate is. And so I just want to give everybody who's watching this or watching the recording later, to just give you some permission to feel that, and to just be realistic, that you look at the long ballot and you think, I can't understand everything on here. And so each election, we just pick one or two and say, I will learn about that position. I'll try to understand more about what does my school board do, or back in the primaries, there were a lot of just little like judge positions that we had to evaluate. Another piece of advice that I find so helpful is find friends who are also interested in learning, and especially if you have friends who have different views than you do. So split the load with them and ask, okay, learn about this position, learn about this candidate, and then you can come together and compare. And then you have some way to build community with your friends and learn different perspectives. And then the last one is just be kind to yourself. Like, don't expect perfection to understand everything going on your ballot every single election. So the first one I wanted to cover is on the Texas Constitution. And again, this was without getting into the weeds of how our Texas Constitution works, there's a lot of things that in other states that state legislatures would just make changes, and we elected them and they passed these changes and we roll with it. And in Texas, there's a lot more that they have to do to get voter approval to be amended. And so there's a couple going on right now that are amendments to the Texas Constitution, and they have to do with the exciting world of property taxes. And again, property taxes are one of those things that people love to complain about, but the more work you put into understanding where they came from and how they are just basically the backbone of funding throughout Texas, the more interesting it really does get to understand what's going on. And so I'm not going to get into the details of it. I've provided some of the references for what the current ballot propositions are for changes to the tax structure on property taxes. But I did want to say that for a lot of us, like if I go to vote, these will be the only things I'm voting on because my city council elections were canceled. Now, hopefully that made you curious of how do they just cancel an election? So we'll get into that one. Um, so again, systems of government, we understand that we've got the federal government, we've got the state government. Within Texas, we have 254 counties and they have their own governments. And then within our counties, we have our cities, and the cities administer things that they're uniquely responsible for. And we might have, again, all different types of specific things that each of those, like there are things that only the state can do, things that only the county can do, things that only the city can do. And so the city elections are coming up, and cities have a little bit of choice. Like some cities do their elections in November, most of them do it in May. And the state has set a calendar. So we're not going to have just like a city who wants to be sneaky and say, oh, let's do an election during Thanksgiving week when nobody's around. Like that, no, cities can't do that. The cities have to follow the state calendar. And so we've got these uniform election dates, and the May date is coming up. And so again, you'll see generally city or school board elections on those dates. Now, sometimes nobody runs for office or only one person runs for office. So where I live, there were two city council seats that were up for reelection. Um, and neither of them had opponents. They both were the only people running, and so the city said, well, I guess we don't need to do an election. And so that's how an election ends up being just straight up canceled. Um, and so again, depending on your city, some of y'all had that, some of y'all didn't. Now, when we get into the weeds, I included a link to the Texas Municipal League, which is basically an organization that explains and supports how city government works in Texas. There is very specific law in the state of Texas about how cities exist, how they operate. There's different classes of cities, different legal structures. And again, if you want to get into the weeds on that, I've provided that information so you can go into great detail about it. Um, but I assume that most people don't want to get into the very specific classes of cities because unless you live in one of those, it doesn't impact you a ton. But I wanted to highlight that just to say that if you are in a really small city, then you might see different structures here. And I'm going to be focusing on the larger cities because, again, all of us generally live in cities. I will comment that part of why I find this so interesting is like just me as a person. I grew up not in a city. I grew up in a rural area that did not have a city government. We just had county regulations. And so where I lived, we didn't have fire services. And it was a bit of a drama where I lived because it was common for people to burn trash in their backyards and then fires to get out of control. And there would be this issue of who would come. And so at times the city would come and then try to charge people for the use of the fire services. But if you're in a city, you pay city taxes and the city takes care of it. So that's one of those advantages of living in a city, and that you'll have city police services. There are some bigger things such as water and sewer services. Again, growing up in a rural area, we had a septic system and all of the sewer things were contained within our own acreage. But in a city, you can't have that. People live too close together. And so a city takes responsibility for water services, sewer services, and I included a link to a major drainage project that's happening in the city of Dallas, where the city is responsible for essentially paying attention to what areas flood and how can they prevent stormwater from wrecking people's neighborhoods, from wrecking the streets. And so they're investing in a major drainage project. All of these things like streets and sidewalks, there are some that are state responsibilities, some that are county responsibilities, some that are city responsibilities. So depending on what's going on in your neighborhood, such as if there's issues with sidewalks, that might be a city council issue. And so it's important that we pay attention to, is our city council keeping up with sidewalks? Do they have the funding for it? One of the biggest issues is land use and zoning, and I'll circle back to this a few different times, but this is related to how land within a city is divided out. So it's things like making sure that you don't have major industrial areas with 18-wheelers right next to an elementary school where kids may be walking across the street. There's things that are safety issues. And so they create zones that say houses go here, development for businesses goes in a different area, industry goes somewhere else. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I've brought up the safety issue. And then there's this issue, I just put the terms healthy tax base. And this is circling back to the property taxes issue. But depending on the people who live in the city and the types of businesses in the city budgets have to balance, do we have enough commercial? Are we getting money from sales tax, or are we getting money mainly from the businesses, from like industries in the city, or are we getting most of our revenue from residential properties? And one of the things that cities have to consider is that as people stay in their houses over time, the state has certain exemptions or certain tax breaks that people get after they reach a certain age. And so cities occasionally, when they have aging populations, start to have tax revenue problems because the people, as they age, um, essentially pay proportionately less tax than people who had recently purchased a new house and who are younger. So again, without getting into the full formulas of that, that's something that cities have to consider, that if they have a tax base that's only residential, that 20 or 30 or 40 years in the future, that could be essentially a revenue problem. They wouldn't be able to continue to pay for city services. So back to the fun city services, things like parks, pools, trails, public spaces. Where I live, the city council just approved funding for a couple of like splash pads and a dog park that they found money in the existing city budget to say, hey, we're going to build these nice new amenities because people have been wanting that. Or things like rec centers, libraries, and other community centers. Some of the bigger cities start creating special use districts, and I put the information there on Fort Worth's plan for Panther Island, which is a massive project that involves essentially like drainage issues, water rights, and also how do we create like an entertainment hub that people want to come to. So again, if you want to get into the weeds of that, there's so much cool information about how city councils plan to make cities robust and vibrant long term. And I'm not saying that this is everything that cities do. These are just the things that, again, in conversations with people, the things that they highlight the most as this is a cool thing that my city is working on. Basic information about our city government. In most cities, the mayor essentially is the figurehead, the guy who shows up and um, cuts the ribbon for new buildings opening, new businesses opening, um, and is a public functionary. And he doesn't have a lot of authority otherwise. While in other cities, they operate with cities that have what's called a strong mayor model. And in those cities, the mayor, she might have a lot more of the day-to-day operations. So at the bottom of the slide, I mentioned that most cities use a city manager as the main administrator. And so in most cities, the day-to-day operations happens through the city manager, but in some cities, it is the mayor themselves that do it. The city council helps to guide the direction of the city, and the biggest thing there is they manage the money. They have control over the budget, they get to approve the budget, and so they vote on that one. And I've gone to my local city's city council meetings quite a bit to just watch which type of things come before the city. And again, the biggest drama of the year is always what is the budget? What funding requests do the various departments have? And it's everything from the library is asking for money for new computers. Can the city approve that? Or the parks maintenance department would like to contract out the mowing instead of having the parks employees mow certain parks themselves. So it's things like that that the council helps to guide the direction of the city. And then again, zoning is a big deal of which things they can approve. Now, there's a lot of this that there are state guidelines on, and so they're constrained within a certain range. Some of it goes down to how much can cities regulate building materials, how much can cities regulate sign heights. But I'm sure a lot of y'all have noticed that as you drive through different cities, that you'll see that in some cities, most of the buildings have the same color of brick, or most of the buildings have the same height of signs. And in other cities, you might have signs that are all kinds of different heights. One of the places, and I'm going to use a elsewhere in the state reference for this one, but I grew up in the Houston area, and Houston is kind of like the Wild West of zoning, that Houston has pretty loose regulations on what can be built in various areas. And then there's other suburbs that were pretty tightly controlled. And you would strongly notice this, like you'd be driving in part of Houston, and it's just signs of all kinds of different heights. Buildings just look like they're all from different eras. And then you cross into a suburb like Sugarland, and the signs are uniform. There's very tight regulation on what things look like. And that, again, that's a function of the city council's decisions on what things look like. So keep that in mind as you're paying attention in the city you live in. How tightly does your city regulate what things should look like? So another fun thing going on with our city council elections. Um, as you look at your ballots, you might start seeing things like there's council members, and uh, it might show as like place 2 or place 6. Now, this one, I'm going to give the big picture because it varies by your city. Actually, I'm going to jump to the picture of Fort Worth. Look at all these different districts that they are kind of geographically drawn out. And then we see the little holes where there's other cities inside of Fort Worth. So Fort Worth has the districts, but in some cities, all the council members are elected by the entire city population. And you tend to see this in smaller cities that, such as where I live, all of the council members are elected by the entire city. Other cities, generally larger cities, are divided into districts. And so in some of those, only residents of that district can vote for that particular district. And this is common in the largest cities. In some mid-sized cities, the election is citywide. So everybody in the city is voting on people, but to be in a particular district, the people running have to live in that region. And then I put this little link. Again, this is for the extra credit opportunity for the people who are just really interested, that there's kind of this problem that happens in some cities. And specifically here, I link to an issue that happened in McKinney, which is the county seat of Collin County. But they have a system where there are districts. You have to live in that district to vote. You have to live in that district to run for office there. But then there was a city council member that was politically unpopular, and the entire city voted on the recall elections. And there was this question of, is that legal? Is that okay if you supposedly are district specific, but then the entire city has recall authority? And so I linked to a lawsuit there, and the case ended up being dismissed, but the person whose place on city council was like, he was put up to a recall election and the city voted to kick him out. He filed this lawsuit saying, this is a problem, this is subverting the district. And there is a legal issue going on here as it relates to racial representation in our local government. But again, I would hand that back to your government instructors to explain in more detail. So we've talked a little bit about Fort Worth on that one. And now to the fun part. So now we have a picture of how city councils operate, what are the things they vote for, but how do we know who to vote for? How do we know how to evaluate candidates? And so some of the common themes in local cities is this question of, how do we view our city? What is our vision for the city? Some cities have a vision of being a destination in terms of a lot of restaurants, a lot of apartments, the type of place that has a vibrant nightlife, but very few single family homes. Some cities, that's who they want to be. They want to be an entertainment destination. Other cities view themselves as like a rural enclave or a lower density city. So the ways that city councils do that is by regulating what is the minimum size of a house or what is the minimum size of a lot. And there are some cities who make regulations that say, in order to build a house here, you must be on at least 1 acre of land. And so that will make the city inherently a low density city. So as people are running for office, you have to evaluate, which vision for the city am I on board with? Another of the tensions inherent in our city council candidates are priorities of, do we want to have a low tax rate or do we want to be a city that has a higher tax rate and has more meaningful public services? So the ways that I've seen this pop up in cities around here are often, again, do we want to be a city that offers a lot of parks, a lot of city services in terms of rec centers? Do we want to be a city that has a robust library system, or do we want to be a city that is very cautious with spending on things like that? Now, another element of how we evaluate candidates, and this one, I mentioned earlier that city elections are technically nonpartisan. Technically is a word that carries a lot of weight in that sentence. They are currently technically nonpartisan, but political parties will often promote particular candidates. And we've seen this pop up in quite a few cities. There's even been issues where statewide politicians start endorsing particular candidates in city elections, even though they are theoretically nonpartisan. So as you get to evaluate candidates, sometimes you notice that they are overtly saying that they are nonpartisan, but then covertly accepting support, yard signs, endorsements from particular partisans. So this can be something that, again, depending on your view, this can be a problem because it's putting all of these national and state level politics onto things that don't really have much to do with city services. But on the flip side, this can be a good thing if you view it as these candidates are getting in the political pipeline. They're getting themselves established with a career of public service and are showing that they can be, trusted in public office. And so depending on your view on that one, that can be a good thing, that can be a bad thing, depends on your city. And then this last one is just a huge, messy topic that sometimes there are other issues going on. And again, part of me would like to apologize for having non-Tarrant County examples here, but maybe it's good that I'm not dipping my toe in the messier ones. That there was an issue in Dallas a few years ago where it had to do with development of a particular shopping center and proposal for parking garages and proposal for how tall of an apartment building would be built there. And basically, the former mayor was so frustrated with the direction the city council was taking that she decided to run for office again. That there was one specific issue that she thought was important, and she tried to run on that platform alone. Another one happened it's a tiny town in Collin County, where there was a proposed cemetery that would be outside of the city limits. Now, the city council couldn't make any regulations about it because it was outside of the city limits, but because of the way that Texas law worked, it was in what's called their ETJ, their extraterritorial jurisdiction. And so it came before the city council, but they essentially couldn't say no to it. And the fun thing is, if they had tried to shut down this proposed cemetery, it would have been due to overt racial and religious animosity. Um, but it was a huge issue of public concern because it was a small town that was worried about a proposed Islamic cemetery on the outskirts of the city. Now, again, I would like to be clear, the city could do literally nothing under state law, but it became a huge issue to the point where I went to the city council candidate forum for this one and helped be one of the moderators for the candidate forum because they had explicitly said, we need people not from the city. We need another outside group to help moderate this because it is so contentious. Um, but that was something that had massive voter turnout where the voters were just dissatisfied with what the city was doing. Now, again, I've said about 3 times the city could do nothing about it. But sometimes, and I bring this one up as sometimes local elections are really contentious. And if we're not paying attention to what's going on, we'll just have no idea why so many people are heated about things. Now, I also included a link here to a later Justice Department ruling. So, long story short, they voted out the old city council members, new people came in, tried to stop the cemetery, were found to be discriminating against the group on religious grounds. The Justice Department got involved and say, hey, stop discriminating. So there was huge political drama over that, and it ended up costing the city a ton of money, mostly in attorney's fees, because the city council tried to discriminate against people on the basis of religion. So who said local politics was boring? All kinds of things happen. So keep an eye out for that as local elections are happening, who knows what drama might be beneath the surface. Another of the big things, city councils not just manage the budget, but also can propose bonds. So bonds are basically the city asking to take a giant loan. They need voter approval in order to borrow significant amounts of money. Now there's a tiny like municipal bonds that they can issue, but when it's a large bond, they need permission from the voters. And the basic premise here is it is very hard for a city to gather 25 million or 50 million or huge amounts of money to build a new building. But if they borrow the money, they can be paying the mortgage over this number of years. So depending on what they're trying to build, sometimes it can be a really good long-term investment. This happened in my city a few years ago where they needed to build a new police department. They needed to build a new public services facility, and the cost would have been significant. It would have taken the city about 8 or 10 years in existing revenue in order to build this building. But they have a need now. They needed somewhere that when people were arrested in the city, they needed a place to detain them instead of having to send a number of police officers to take the person to the county lockup. And so sometimes we need this item within the next couple of years. Um, Another of the things we'll see popping up are changes to the city charter that the cities can't just change their own rules without asking us. And Fort Worth has quite a few of those going on. I was fascinated reading about some of these. Some of them are meaningful changes, some of them are technical changes. The one that I found particularly interesting on Fort Worth's proposed changes was that apparently in the Fort Worth City Charter, there was language about a city health department, but apparently the county takes care of all of that. And so they're asking, why do we even have this in the city text? So you can click through that link and read more about that. And then the last one, and I saw this on 3 or 4 cities in Tarrant County, is that sales tax, there's a certain percentage that um, sales tax can be used for street maintenance, but it needs voter approval. And so some of the cities would like to fix their streets and they can use sales tax. And I thought that was an interesting one too, because I've seen that show up in a lot of cities as a bond election of we would like to borrow $40 million. And so it's interesting to say, oh, your sales tax could be used on that one. Yeah, that is, Fort Worth has a lot going on. Um, and I wanted to give a lot more just pros and cons on bond elections because there's just, again, so much rhetoric that goes on. And I wanted to help us think through some of the issues. Um, There's specific language that the state has regulated, that the state of Texas has said, this is how this needs to be communicated. And it is, I'm just going to say it's dry and confusing, which leaves a lot of room for political rhetoric to just kind of slip in to how we think through things. But one of the things to keep in mind is, I currently I live in a particular city. I have a house. We pay property taxes on the house. We get the existing city services. And if they were to start setting aside money that I'm paying in taxes and then saying, oh, we're going to build something 10 years from now, they're taking my money and not doing anything with it that helps me at the moment. The thing about bonds is it's borrowing the money and then paying in the future. And so depending on what the investment is, if it's a new bridge, if it's new roads, if it's a new library, then bonds actually push the burden onto the people who are actually benefiting from the proposed services. So that's one of the reasons why conceptually bonds can be like fiscally make sense, because why would they take my money and not give me a meaningful public service from it, as opposed to taxing the people years in the future? That said, sometimes it's questions of does this actually match the direction I want my city to go? And I see this a lot with proposed road improvements or road expansions, that there's concerns of, well, we currently have this nice 2-lane county road, scenic drive. Do we really want to replace it with a 6-lane freeway type of road? Is that who we want to be as a city? And so occasionally people will vote down the bonds because they don't match the direction they want the city to go. There's also this tension of city growth in general. One of the metro problems that we have is if one city doesn't expand their roads and one city doesn't build apartments and one city doesn't build new housing, the next city next to it might still do that and then have traffic driving through the city. And so if one city says no new apartments, the next city says, great, that's more tax revenue for us. And you'll still have the same people driving on the roads. And so that's just kind of this tension, that depending on which cities you're in, there can be that rhetoric, but it's not necessarily, well, if we say no to this in our city, we'll still have the same thing. It's just somebody else is going to get the tax revenue out of it. Um, Even the most careful calculation can't account for potential economic issues. We saw this quite a bit in the mid 2000s. Quite a few suburbs in the Dallas area were rapidly expanding and finding themselves, they don't have enough roads, they don't have the city buildings, and they say, okay, we need a new city hall. We need something because we just can't house all the people we have to hire to manage the city. We can't fit into the existing library anymore. And so they make these careful calculations and say, okay, city growth has been a consistent 8% over the last 5 years. And so let's assume it's going to keep happening. And then the Great Recession happened. And a lot of cities had borrowed assuming that they would have steady revenue, and they didn't. And they had to then increase the taxes to make up for that gap. So if anytime a person says, "Oh, vote for this, it will not impact your taxes," they're being a little too confident there. So be very careful about saying it won't impact your taxes. But the question remains, is it still a good investment even if it does? So I mentioned earlier that my city needed a new police department, that they were having this issue where they'd arrest somebody and they wouldn't have a holding cell that they could actually put them in. So it meant that they had to have the police officers drive them to the county lockup, which then was a problem because they had fewer police officers who could be in the city policing because they were driving 40 minutes to the county seat and 40 minutes back. So there was a cost associated with not building a new public safety complex. And so there's a lot of those things that sometimes we get sticker shock at. Look at how many millions of dollars they want to build, but what's the cost if they don't? That said, the flip side is, what's wrong with the current buildings that they have? In my example, yeah, there was a problem, but sometimes there's different city offices, city buildings. Sometimes cities ask for a new city hall complex, and their design is essentially like this is a shiny, beautiful building with massive office spaces. And sometimes we get the impression that our elected officials are just trying to make like, here's our beautiful, like, we're doing this so that we have a proud legacy of, look at this thing I built. And I can think of at least one school administration building that as people drive by it, they wonder like, how did you have money for that? How is this a district that says they can't pay teachers and yet they have money for such a nice administration building? So there, again, there's some technicalities there of what things can be borrowed to pay for and which things can't. But I don't want to come across it being like, oh, bonds are great or bonds are terrible. There's just a lot of different sides to it that we can spend some time evaluating. So I'm going to talk about the school districts a little bit. I'm actually going to spend less time on this one, largely because it varies so much by what city you're in. But the quick recap of what do our school districts do, what do the trustees do, they have the same basic thing of approving the budgets, selecting the superintendents, and some of the general direction or vision of the schools, as well as we have bond elections in some cities coming up. And the same kind of questions of how do we evaluate? Some schools have a vision for one massive school, and that school can be like top in its sports league, things like that. Other cities have visions of saying, let's have lots of small schools and have 8 or 10 different high schools in a city so that students at each of those have a smaller school experience. And the candidates that we vote for are the ones shifting that. How much of an emphasis on sports? How much money do they invest in that one? Again, I try not to be too dismissive of that one because I understand that high school sports is basically a religion for a lot of people. But that's one of those things that we keep an eye on is what direction are the school boards going in, how they view sports, how they prioritize that in spending. Now, I bring up this partisan rhetoric thing again. Again, technically, school boards are nonpartisan, but they have become sharply politicized in recent years. Then you're seeing more and more political rhetoric. And especially in the past couple of years, we've had a huge number of superintendents just basically like quit their jobs because they're frustrated with the political issues going on in education. Some of it is there's all kinds of talk about which books should libraries have, which textbooks should be allowed. Some of that I want to be careful about saying, oh, that's a school board's responsibility, because some of that is set by the state board of education, and then the schools just kind of roll with it. But some of it is also set by our local school districts. Same thing with city councils, that there's often a covert partisan battle going on, even as they are technically nonpartisan. And again, sometimes there's this pipeline issue where people are running for office to get themselves established, and they see that the local school board is a good place to do that. So how do we make sense of this? Again, the thing that I love about local elections is that, especially if you're in a smaller city, you can usually actually meet the people running for office. Like, you don't have that opportunity with national level candidates. You don't have that opportunity most of the time with state level. Sometimes you get to meet the people who are running for state representative or judge or some of the local offices. But when it comes to city elections and school board elections, those are the ones where you really can get to know the candidates. City council meetings often are not poorly, depends on the city, but in some cities, very few people show up to them. And so you can actually see how your local government operates. So I just encourage everybody to like go meet the candidates and ask them some questions and get to know them. And some of the go-to questions that I found useful over time to just ask people, why are they running for office? And sometimes you get really interesting answers. Sometimes people just say, oh yeah, I wanted to give back to my city. Sometimes people gotta be in their bonnet about something in particular, like there's some local issue that they say this is a big deal and this is why I'm running. And you get to learn a lot about a person with their reasoning for why they decided to run. Now, sometimes you'll get kind of like non-answers, um, or just people saying, well, I've just always wanted to run for city council. That sometimes with local elections, we get a particular type of candidate who basically is like, this would be a good good pin to have, a good thing to say, oh, I did this. Um, and so sometimes they don't even have a vision for what they would change in the city. They just think it would be cool to like be in a position of power. And again, you might see that as a good thing, you might see that as a bad thing, but it is interesting to hear that when you ask, why should I vote for you? And they're just kind of like, because, like, interesting. So asking those specific questions about what do you like about how the city is run or how the school board is run, what would you change? That really opens up those possibilities to hear what makes this person tick. Another question that I like to ask, it varies by person, but how often have you attended this meeting that you're running for? There are times where get people get involved in city politics because they have an issue, they have something they care about, and so they show up. And they show up to the meetings and you see them at the meetings. And there's other times where they just said, "Oh, that'd be a cool thing to do." And so one of the best ways to identify that split is, have they been going to the meetings? Um, so you get to know, how is this a recent interest or a long-term interest? Where do you suggest I go to learn more about this position? Sometimes there are local social media pages or local blogs or other things that can help you understand what's going on in your city in particular. The problem with this is you'll often get pointed to one-sided sources. So if you ask, if there's two or three people running for this position, ask all of them and get different sides of it. But a lot of the different cities will have, there was one that I just refer to as the angry blogger. Like, she was always upset about something, and then she would stir up people to like get mad at something. And then people would point to her blog as the best place to go to get to know what's happening in the city, when her blog was essentially positioned over, let's get people angry about something. So if you get pointed to these really one-sided things, you'll know what people are angry at, but you won't know the reality underneath it. But if you ask multiple people that, you might get a more robust picture of that one. And keep in mind that in cities, especially smaller cities, there's a pretty low voter turnout that, depending on the city, it's generally, unless there's a big issue going on, it's generally 2 to 5% of people vote in city elections, and the margins are often in the couple of dozen votes kind of difference in smaller cities. And so the candidates really do want your vote. They really do want to talk to you. And so you actually do have this cool opportunity to get to know them, and get to know more about the city. So I just encourage everybody, election day is actually one of the best times to meet people because they're all out there campaigning on that day. Um, So if you can make time on election day. When is that? Hopefully I got my dates correctly on this one. Uh, but we're currently in the midst of early voting for our city elections. Um, and then the big election day is actually on a Saturday. But if you want to do early voting, then we do have early voting throughout this week and as well as on Sunday. But for city elections, like it is bad advice to say wait until election day on most elections. But for city elections, it's often the most fun because you do get to meet most of the candidates for local elections, again, depending on your city. I don't want to oversell that one, but if you're in a smaller city, then they'll all be out there with their tents battling for your vote. So a few of these resources, again, League of Women Voters and Ballotpedia, generally have resources. The League of Women Voters sends out questionnaires to candidates. Sometimes they respond, sometimes they don't. I've heard people say, if they don't respond to that questionnaire, I don't vote for them. And I don't think that's a good metric because things get caught in the spam filter. And speaking as a person who has been responsible for sending out those questionnaires before, there's all kinds of reasons why people don't respond to that. So don't don't think too deeply on that one. Don't overread if they don't respond to that. So I got through in exactly the time I wanted to. So I know that was a lot of information about cities and what's going on in cities. What type of questions do y'all have about it? Anything interesting pop up in the chat as I was going?
I don't think we had any
Yeah.
questions in the
Okay.
chat.
Does that mean that I covered everything perfectly in a ton of detail?
I think that's what that means.
That's how I choose to interpret that. Um, So I know you've been in the Fort Worth area for a while, right? Like, do you have any examples of just interesting local issues that have popped up in recent years?
School boards have been interesting recently. The TCC board has been very interesting
Oh, yeah.
recently. If
Yeah.
you guys are interested in that, I highly recommend you check out our board meetings. We record them and we post them online.
Oh, yeah. So these public meetings, like, I think that going in person is one of the best ways of just experiencing. You get to see everybody's reactions. But the second best thing is to watch the recordings. As a matter of state law, they have to be, like if it's the decision-making board, they have to be recorded and publicly available for the public parts of the meetings. So it's a good interesting thing to keep up on.
And if you have a pet issue, you're also allowed to speak.
Oh, yeah. Have you ever spoken at a city council meeting?
Not at the city council, but I have at the TCC board.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I used to haunt our city council meetings, but again, it's been a little while.
So I have
Good.
posted in the chat the link to get credit. Make sure that you fill that out. Please let us know what instructor you are attending if you're attending for credit, and that way I can get that email out to them. And just remember, every instructor has different policies on when you will see the credit. Some you will see it immediately. Lots of professors put it in right before the end of class so that you don't rely on that credit to pass. Thank you, Professor Kinfield. This was really good.
Thanks. I think I'm gonna put a smiley face on my screen again.
You've earned it.
Yay. Maybe I was too generous on how much question time to leave. No, I think we're perfect.
Hello, I just want to